Calliope's Tale by FalcomReynolds. Chapter 14. Across the Horizon. Calliope paced the sun, out in the open, the entire time they ran from Alizarin. Every glance she shot back at the horizon saw his life ships drifting gently over the battlefield. She could see, even from the distance, even as they got further away, a strange distortion in the air. It twisted and writhed in place like a nest of mudworms, almost as if the sky itself were trying to flee, but was being contained. The air stank of honey and decaying flesh and alcohol, sharp and stinging. It made Calliope gag. Alizarin, working his vile craft. She could see the heretic on the waves, claiming her victory. As they went, the wind was cut through with other scents. Denzel's mint and lemongrass, as he left thick sea ice over the waves behind him, and the myriad scents of hundreds of other magic users amongst the fleet's collective crew. Calliope occasionally glanced towards the Curse of the North and saw Denzel standing at the aft rail, brow furrowed, staring at the sea. He'd positioned the Curse at the rear of the fleet to cover their retreat, her massive gray iron hull shielding the wooden ships from any stray shots. She was going much slower than she could to keep herself between the fleet and their enemy, and she could control her speed through her huge engines. The rest of the fleet had to rely on the wind, though with the number of gifted pirates, the wind was in their favor, tinged with the smell of magic. None of the other ships seemed to pay much mind to Calliope down in the water. They had bigger things to worry about, Calliope thought, and she didn't care to hide when she was more concerned with trying to see if Ianthe was all right. Ianthe was not dead, but she was unconscious, and no one seemed to be able to wake her. "Let me up," Calliope said, the instant she heard this.
"We'll have to wait until we're a safe distance from the fleet," McCullough told her from the rails.
His face was pale and troubled, the skin tight around his jaw.
"We can't yet. I'm sorry."
"I will claw my way up the side of the ship."
"I know you can, but we can't stop. Just wait, please."
Calliope had to satisfy herself with staying close enough to the sun's hull that she brushed against the wood every now and then. It took an agonizing hour and a half for the horizon to erase Alizarin from their view, and that was when Denzel, who was now the one in charge, given that Kiera's ship had been destroyed, gave the signal that they could stop. "So let me up!" Calliope shouted to the sun's crew. "Now!" They let down one of the lifeboats for her. She ignored the attention she was now gathering from nearby ships that let down anchors in the water and hauled herself up onto the boat, flicking her tail tip impatiently while they pulled her back up. She was far larger than any of them, and could tell it was a struggle for the crew members to pull her up. Additionally, it was a struggle for the ship to have to deal with her weight and now tipping the balance dangerously to port. She ignored that, and as soon as the boat was level with the ship's rails, she rolled out of it and onto the deck and glanced around for Ianthe. The first mate was, thankfully, still out on the deck. They hadn't moved her since she'd fallen at the rail save to transfer her from seawater-stained planks onto a sturdy wood and cloth cot. She lay there, nearly motionless. "Ianthe!" Calliope said urgently, and dragged herself over, claws leaving deep gouges in the decks. Someone might scold her for those later. She didn't particularly care. Ianthe was breathing, slow and deep, for all appearances asleep. Her pulse was very slow, but steady, and her face relaxed.
"I think she'll be all right,"
McCullough said, stepping up next to Ianthe.
"I hope. It would be a real struggle to find another first mate as good as she is."
"You'd better not."
That was a joke."
McCullough sighed, clasping his hands behind his back.
"I'm really worried about her. It was a joke."
"Oh." Calliope reached out and cupped Ianthe's face with one hand. Her palm was large enough to cover the entire side of Ianthe's face. She brushed her thumb gently over the first mate's nose and cheek, careful not to nick her skin with her claws, then withdrew. "Got it."
"She'll be fine. I don't know much about how the goddesses work. despite how long I've spent with Ianthe's company. But, well, no, that's not true. But I don't know about that one.
That one. The goddess of salt, of life, and death. Both the unexpected and uncertain, and the known and dreaded. Calliope didn't know her either, and didn't care to. Footsteps on the deck behind them. Calliope didn't bother turning to look.
We have to go back,
someone said, an imperious, irritated voice.
There's no excuse for...
A pause. For... Kiera Zidane said, and then...
What is that?
Calliope glanced over her shoulder. The captain had dried out from earlier, but was in a rather sorry state still. Her clothing crusted with salt and her light brown skin marked with a number of cuts and scrapes from when her ship had been turned to matchsticks with her on board.
Hello,
Calliope said to her, and turned in place, putting herself between Kiera and Ianthe. Miculo glanced over to her quickly and stayed by her side, hands still behind his back.
I'm sorry,
Kiera said, taking a step backwards and glancing towards the Midnight Sun's crew.
Is that a married?
Yes, Miculo said.
I sure am,
Calliope said. And I'm right here. You can just talk to me instead of asking other people.
That's not...
Kiera started, then stopped, taking a deep breath. She closed her eyes for a second, rubbed her forehead, then looked up through her fingers. Her eyes, rich brown with golden spots, drove into Calliope's own.
You,
she said instead.
I remember you.
Yes, I pulled you out of the water earlier, Calliope said. She refused to be intimidated by a crown-appointed captain who didn't even have a ship. She'd never even been subjected to Kiera's gaze before, and while it might have worked something akin to magic on crown sailors, Calliope wasn't impressed by it now. You're welcome for that, by the way.
That was you.
There was another ship.
Yep,
it's gone, don't worry, Calliope said, cutting her off hurriedly. The sea had washed the blood from the gun, and Miculo didn't know about the pirates she'd killed. All taken care of. Got you away from that one, too. So I'd appreciate it if you didn't attack me or anything. Kiera fell silent again. Miculo glanced over at Calliope. He seemed calm, but she could see him fiddling with his sleeve collar behind his back.
Calliope is... she lives with us, he managed. You have a married that lives on your ship.
Kiera folded her arms, setting her weight back on one leg. It seemed that her best defense was to be annoyed by any given situation. Miculo shrugged.
Around it, really. She's too big to come on board now.
Now? If she's done this before.
Oh, yeah, all the time. When she was little, anyway.
When she was little?
Miculo shrugged. You know, smaller than she currently is.
I'm not looking for a definition of a word I already know, Captain Miculo. I'm looking for an explanation. They raised me, Calliope said, breaking into the exchange. On board, since I was a baby. I live here. Is that good enough? Do you need more, or... Kiera didn't answer. Ianthe woke up towards evening, after being tended to for most of the day. Calliope almost cried in relief. Though the first mate was weak, she was alive, which was more than either of them had expected. I never want to do that again, Ianthe said fervently, when she was conscious and aware enough to speak. There was a faraway cast to her gaze. Calliope couldn't possibly know what was inside her mind, but she could tell that the first mate had seen and experienced something most humans would never know. That was awful. Channeling her? Yes. Ianthe closed her eyes again and took a breath, then held out her hands. The fingertips, which were normally dark, had been scarred salt white, as if the color had been drained from them. The color hadn't returned at all since she'd fallen unconscious. I was her for one moment. I have never felt something so alien, so uncaring. The other gods will listen and speak. This one. She trailed off, shaking her head. Calliope extended one hand and Ianthe took hold of it, though she had to use both hands simply to hold Calliope's. No, never again. Just after nightfall, Denzel came on board to meet with Ianthe and Kiera, as did Sun Yang. I'm not sure how to deal with this situation, he admitted, looking down. Kiera folded her arms, glowering at the floorboards. Perhaps, she said carefully, we underestimated him. Perhaps, Sun Yang glanced over. Perhaps we underestimated him. I lost 5 of my fleet, and countless more ships have sustained horrendous amounts of damage. Kiera did not look down. She stared icily back. The Queen's bounty is gone. I am well aware of our mistake. No, you do not. Sun Yang narrowed their eyes. For you, the problem is easy to fix. You tell your superiors, they punish you, they give you new ships. They sell you new ships. They assign new sailors to your ships. The problem is solved. For us, who run our own lives, such things are not so easily dismissed. We value each and every one of our ships and crew because we cannot replace them like new toys for a petulant child. We should have been more careful. We should have planned better. We should have waited to learn more about Alizarin's dead ships. Easy, Denzel said, holding up a hand. We all misjudged Alizarin's capabilities. But even the Peacebringers did not know the full extent of their power. Regardless of the happenstances, we must figure out what to do next. Blaming each other is pointless. Kiera let out a long, controlled breath. We've suffered a great defeat at his hands, she said, through gritted teeth. I suppose we should call upon the Crown next, and hope that they view him as enough of a threat to send their own navy against. A great defeat? Calliope felt a jolt in her stomach. Were they planning to give up? No, they couldn't. We will fight Alizarin still, she blurted, and Kiera jumped again, still unused to her presence, or perhaps just to her voicing her opinions. The other captains glanced over at her as she flicked her tail tip over the deck with a wet smack and dug her claws into the salt-stained wood. He's not gone yet, and he's going to bring all his ships back, along with any he destroyed today. He can do it, and he will do it. We have to try again. We can't fight him, Ianthe said from her cot, shaking her head. Why not? He'll win. Her voice was so sure. Her despair showed on her face, grated in her words like a heavy stone in a net. She kept rubbing her fingertips together over the coarse fabric of her coat, the smooth wood of the ship. Calliope glanced up. Everyone else watched her. Kiera Zidane looked uncomfortable, jaw working as she ran her top lip between her teeth. Sun Yang was breathing a little harder than they normally did, their hands tucked into their sleeves. Ianthe was staring at the floorboards. Mikula was running his palm over the pommel of his sword, and Denzel was watching her with cautious, curious eyes. Calliope took a few deep breaths. All of them were so afraid of Alizarin, so afraid of what he could do, so unwilling to sacrifice their crew to bring him down. And she understood that. She too felt fear when she thought of Alizarin's dead ships, his tight-lipped smile, his hissing, curdled words on the wind, flicking against her ears and trailing over her face and throat. But her fear was eclipsed by something else. Her anger, bright as sunlight, cold as seawater, swift as storm clouds. We can't fight him. He'll win. Calliope cocked her head to the side, eyes shining in the darkness, and smiled, slow and sharp. Are you sure?